dissecting what you've just said there, Husnain, do you think that's because as a society we're encouraged now to speak more English? I know growing up, when my children were young, we had quite a few academic leaders, school leaders, head teachers, deputy head teachers that were making a big push about their schools being, to use a finer word, less advanced, a bit more underprivileged because their children didn't speak English. And I remember one head teacher saying all of our students would speak English as a second language, and the parents were like, no, they don't. We speak English. English is our first language at home, and that
Mm.
push by the academics, by society, by all those that are around us to actually focus more on the language and of our day-to-day language, because we're here and we speak English, we need English, and suddenly that dependency on Urdu, Punjabi, Ingo, whatever the language it be, Hindi, Gujarati, became less, and because of that has now disadvantaged our next generation.
I mean, in English itself is a universally spoken language. You could be anywhere in the world, from Timbuktu all the way down to Hawaii, to United States, all the way down to Dubai, China. I mean, I'm not going to read the countries, but you get my point. That it is a universally spoken language,
Yeah.
and to be able to converse and communicate in English, it's an asset. But what the point I'm trying
Mm.
to raise here is the fact that we do come from an Asian background, and it's kind of nice to still hold on to our language that we used to speak to our grandparents fluently, and I used to speak fluently Urdu, understand Punjabi. But I find the children nowadays, because we communicate more in English, which is fine. You speak English at schools, you're in your work, you're on the phones, you speak English on a regular basis, but having some form of holding on to your language itself, in terms of whatever language you speak at home, is really important to me as a person. I think it's extremely important, and it shouldn't really.
Mm.
I think it's more of an asset being bilingual. I mean, I'm not trying to say you need to be a polyglot where you know all other languages, but in schools they do try to teach you French, Spanish, other languages. But having that extra ability to speak your own language with the elderly, it's nice. It's comforting to know that people can. But I feel now, and speaking to a few friends of mine who've got growing up, young children, they find it extremely difficult as well, because they try to speak to them in Urdu, Punjabi, whichever language they grew up with. They find it difficult because children are not really responding to that. They will understand it, but they can't communicate. So I think that is an issue. Some may say, no, it's not an issue because that's just how the world works. But others might say, well, do you know what? I would like them to have some sort of way of communicating. Because if you end up going back to the Indian subcontinent, for instance, or wherever your roots go back to, you need to speak in that language. It's almost
Mm.
like the other person feels compelled to speak English to you, which they do. Hats off to them, they do. They may have broken English, but they do communicate with you. But
Yeah,
we need to be able to speak ourselves, our own language.
And
very
that,
true.
that ability to communicate is your passport, isn't it? If you cannot communicate with a person in their native language, it becomes a barrier for you, doesn't it, immediately?
That is the challenge. Exactly that, Isaac. So obviously, Hassan, you've been a fluent Urdu speaker all your life, right? And there's certain advantages to having command of the other language. For me, it was a little bit different because I come from, so my mother tongue is Hinko, which apparently is a mishmash of Urdu, Punjabi, and everything kind of rolled into one. But from people of our background, there's not many people from at least our community who's speaking that particular language, right? So oftentimes you speak that language at home, with your mother, with your siblings. But then we grew up and we started speaking English more so. So the opportunity for us to apply our mother tongue was very restricted, either to our homes or to our immediate relatives and the like. But I think I've always wanted to learn Urdu, and it has been a little bit of a challenge. But I try to speak Urdu, right? I guess for me, there's that motivation, there's that willingness to have a conversation in Urdu. I mean, I was actually taking an Uber the other day as well, and the driver was like, "Oh, I initially started speaking to him in English, and we kind of struggled the communication, right? But all of a sudden, I kind of switched to Urdu, and the connection was just so much more stronger, right? Because we could communicate in the same language, and he really appreciated the fact that I was trying. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that he said, like, it's a good job that you are at least trying, because there's the younger generation that don't want to engage in Urdu, don't want to speak in Urdu because they probably can't speak Urdu. So there is that little bit of disconnect between that kind of original Asian identity and what we are, which is, I guess, a combination of British and Asian. But culture is what kind of binds us, and language is part of that, really. So yeah, it's a struggle sometimes to navigate.